On September 23, 1944, Belgian farmers working their land near the small village of Kortenberg looked on in disbelief as a huge American B-17 flying fortress emerged from the clouds. The four-engine bomber circled once, lowered its landing gear with mechanical precision, and touched down in a barley field with barely a bump. Its engines kept roaring steadily as the massive aircraft rolled to a halt, propellers glinting in the afternoon light. When local resistance fighters and Allied troops hurried toward the plane, expecting to rescue wounded airmen, what they discovered defied all logic. The B-17 was completely deserted. Not a single crewman aboard. Coffee cups still sat half full and warm to the touch. Half-eaten sandwiches lay on the navigation table. Personal belongings were scattered around the cabin exactly as if the men had just stepped away. The radio remained switched on, tuned to the correct channel. The pilot's seat was pulled back, as though someone had just risen from it. Every system was functioning normally. The fuel tanks still contained hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel. But the 10 men who had departed from England that morning were gone. Vanished. Somehow, the flying fortress had crossed German-occupied Europe, navigated enemy airspace, and landed perfectly in Belgium with nobody at the controls. This is the true account of the Ghost Fortress, one of the most puzzling enigmas of World War II. And what transpired aboard that bomber before it made its impossible journey across the skies of Europe? To grasp just how unbelievable this event was, it helps to understand what a B-17 flying fortress really was. These were not nimble fighter planes. They were enormous, four-engine heavy bombers weighing more than 65,000 pounds when fully loaded. Each one needed a crew of 10 expertly trained men to keep it airborne. The pilot and co-pilot handled the controls from the cockpit. The bombardier lay prone in the glass nose, responsible for releasing the bombs on target. The navigator sat behind him, maps and instruments spread out, charting the route through hostile territory. A flight engineer oversaw the 4 mighty Wright Cyclone engines that kept the plane aloft. A radio operator maintained contact with command and other aircraft, and 4 gunners, positioned in the nose, belly, waist, and tail, defended against enemy fighters. Flying one of these giants demanded constant vigilance. The pilot couldn't simply set a course and relax. The B-17 required continuous corrections for altitude, heading, engine power, and balance. In combat, with German fighters attacking and anti-aircraft shells bursting around them, every crewman had to perform his duty with absolute precision. The notion that such a plane could pilot itself, cross enemy skies, and land smoothly was beyond belief. Yet that is precisely what happened on that September afternoon in 1944. The story began earlier that morning at Molesworth Air Base in Cambridgeshire, home of the 303rd Bombardment Group. 23-year-old First Lieutenant John Cronin and his crew were preparing for a bombing run over Germany. It was considered a routine mission, though in truth, nothing about flying into the heart of German defenses was ever routine. Their target was an industrial complex deep inside enemy territory. Cronin's B-17, affectionately named the Phantom Fortress by its crew, had already completed 34 missions without serious trouble. The men trusted their aircraft and one another. There was no reason to believe this flight would be any different from the dozens before. Before diving deeper into this mystery, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what draws you to stories like this. Are you a World War II history buff? Did someone in your family serve? Leave a comment below. I read them all and truly appreciate hearing from you. And if you enjoy uncovering forgotten wartime mysteries, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. These are stories that deserve to live on. The bomber took off just after dawn, joining the massive formation of flying fortresses that darkened the morning sky. Hundreds of bombers, accompanied by fighter escorts, droned east toward Germany in tight formation. The formation was crucial for survival. German fighters typically attacked bombers that strayed from the group, picking them off one by one. Stay in formation, maintain your position, and watch your fellow bombers watch your back. That was the doctrine that kept crews alive. But about an hour breaking formation. Over Belgium into the mission, somewhere over the Belgian countryside, Cronin's B-17 developed serious trouble. Accounts vary on exactly what went wrong, but multiple sources indicate that the aircraft took damage from either anti-aircraft fire or a malfunction developed in flight. Some reports suggest the number 3 engine began running rough and streaming smoke. Others indicate the bomber was hit by flak that damaged the aircraft's controls. What's certain is that First Lieutenant Cronin made the decision to break formation and turn back toward England. When a B-7 left formation in enemy airspace, the crew faced a terrible choice. Try to nurse the damaged bomber home alone, or abandon the aircraft and parachute into enemy territory. Cronin held the struggling bomber level while he assessed their situation. They were deep over occupied Belgium, still dozens of miles from Allied lines. The English Channel lay between them and the safety of their base. With German fighters prowling Theskies and anti-aircraft batteries tracking them from below, every minute in the air was a gamble with their lives. The crew gathered in the radio compartment to discuss their options. Stay with the plane or bail out. Risk capture or risk crashing? And then, according to the accounts that would later emerge, something happened that made their decision for them. The specific details remain unclear because the crew's debriefing reports were classified for decades after the war. But what we know is this. First, Lieutenant Cronin gave the order to abandon the aircraft. One by one, the 10 men of his crew gathered their parachutes, moved to the bomb bay, and jumped into the sky over Belgium. The bombardier went first, followed by the order to abandon aircraft navigator. The waist gunners jumped next, then the tail gunner, the flight engineer, the radio operator, the ball turret gunner, all followed. Co-pilot Second Lieutenant Harold Debelt went second to last. And finally, First Lieutenant John Cronin, after ensuring every man had safely left the aircraft, climbed out of the pilot seat and threw himself into the empty sky. The crew expected their B-7 to nose over and spiral into the ground within seconds or minutes of the last man jumping. That's what's always happened. When a bomber lost its crew, without human hands on the controls, the aircraft would become unstable. The nose would drop or a wing would dip, and the massive bomber would enter a death spiral that ended in a catastrophic crash. But that's not what happened to the Phantom Fortress. Instead, something extraordinary occurred. The B-7, now flying completely empty, stabilized itself. The trim tabs, control surfaces that help maintain level flight, were apparently set perfectly when Cronin left the cockpit. The throttles were set to cruising speed. The autopilot, a primitive mechanical system by today's standards, was engaged, and rather than falling from the sky, the Ghost Fortress continued flying east, then gradually turned in a wide arc back to the west. It flew on alone through enemy airspace, its shadow passing over forests and villages below, a ghost ship in the afternoon sky. Meanwhile, Cronin and his The Ghost Fortress Flies on crew were descending under their parachutes, each man drifting down alone toward the Belgian countryside below. In 1944, Belgium was still under German occupation, though Allied forces were advancing following the D-Day invasion 3 months earlier. For an American airman parachuting into occupied territory, survival depended on luck and the help of the Belgian resistance. German soldiers patrolled the roads and forests searching for downed Allied airmen. But the Belgian people, despite 4 years of brutal occupation, had organized underground networks dedicated to helping Allied pilots and crew members evade capture and return to England. The 10 men landed scattered across several miles of countryside. Some came down in open fields, others crashed through tree branches into forests. At least one landed in a farmyard, startling the chickens and bringing the farmer running. But incredibly, every single member of Cronin's crew survived the parachute jump. Even more remarkably, Belgian resistance fighters found them quickly before German patrols could locate them. The resistance had become expert at this deadly game, watching the skies for parachutes, moving fast to reach down a airman, and spiriting them away to safe houses before the Germans arrived. Within hours, all 10 men were hidden in barns, cellars, and attics across the Belgian countryside. The resistance would eventually move them through the Underground Railroad that smuggled Allied airmen back to friendly territory. It would take weeks, but every man from Lieutenant Cronin's crew would eventually make it back to England alive. They had survived the bailout, evaded capture, and would live to fly again. But none of them knew that their abandoned bomber was still flying. The Ghost Fortress flew on through the afternoon, maintaining altitude and heading with no human intervention. It passed over German positions, crossed back into the same Belgian territory where its crew had parachuted minutes or hours earlier, and continued westward as if seeking home. How long it flew unmanned, nobody knows for certain. Estimates range from 30 minutes to well over an hour. What is certain is that the massive bomber eventually began to descend. Farmers in the village of Landing itself, in a Belgian field conbear, first heard the distinctive deep rumble of the B-7's 4 engines approaching from the east. The sound of Allied bombers was familiar. They passed overhead daily, but this one sounded different. It was flying low, much lower than the high-altitude formations that usually thundered past. People emerged from their homes and barns, shielding their eyes against the afternoon sun, watching as the fortress came into view. And then they watched in amazement as the bomber began circling the village as if searching for something. The aircraft made one complete circle over the farmland surrounding Cotton Bear. Then, with a mechanical precision that seemed impossible, the landing gear descended from the wings and belly of the aircraft. The massive wheels locked into place with audible clunks that echoed across the fields. The B-7 lined itself up with the longest, flattest barley field available and began its final approach. The nose lifted slightly, the engines throttled back, and the Ghost Fortress settled toward the earth like a bird returning to its nest. The tailwheel touched first, sending up a spray of dirt and crushed barley stalks. Then the main wheels contacted the ground, and the massive bomber rolled across the field, its propellers still turning, slowing gradually from its landing speed. It rolled perhaps 300 FTE before coming to a complete stop in the middle of the field, engines running at idle, exactly as if a pilot had just completed a textbook landing and was waiting for instructions from the tower. The Belgian resistance fighters who reached the plane first approached cautiously, weapons ready, unsure what they would find. German deception tactics were sophisticated. Could this be a trap? But when they climbed through the waist gun positions into the aircraft's interior, they found exactly nothing. No pilot in the cockpit, no crew at their stations, no wounded men in the back. The flying fortress was absolutely completely empty. Yet the engines were still running. The instrument panels glowed with active gauges. The autopilot indicator showed engaged. It was as if the crew had simply vanished into thin air while the aircraft kept flying. Inside the empty bomber resistance fighters shut down the engines and began documenting what they found. Coffee in the cockpit was still warm enough that someone tested it with a finger before dumping it out. Sandwiches on the navigator's table showed fresh bite marks, the bread not yet stale. Personal items were scattered throughout. A deck of playing cards, madame. A paperback book folded open to mark someone's place. Photographs of wives and girlfriends tucked into equipment panels. A half-written letter home describing the morning's breakfast. It looks like the crew had stepped away for just a moment and would return any second. But the most eerie detail was the pilot's seat. It was positioned exactly as it would be for someone of Lieutenant Cronin's height. The seat's height. The distance from the control column, the rudder pedal position, all were set for active flying. The control column itself was in neutral position, and on the throttle quadrant, someone had set the 4-engine throttle's top precise cruising power. The kind of careful adjustment a pilot makes when settling in for a long flight. Everything about the cockpit suggested that a pilot had been flying this aircraft just moments before it landed. Word of the Ghost Fortress spread quickly through Allied intelligence channels. Within days, investigators from the U.S. Army Air Forces arrived to examine the aircraft and try to understand what had happened. They documented the landing site, photographed the aircraft's interior, and interviewed the Belgian witnesses who had seen the landing. They measured the landing tracks in the barley field and calculated the aircraft's approach angle and touchdown speed. Every aspect of the landing appeared normal, professional, exactly what you would expect from an experienced B-17 pilot bringing his aircraft home. When investigators finally located Cronin and the investigation began his crew, the men were as baffled as everyone else. Cronin described giving the order to bail out, ensuring every man left the aircraft safely, and then jumping himself after taking one last look around the cockpit. He insisted he'd not set the autopilot to do anything special. He had not programmed a course. He had not adjusted the trim tabs for unmanned flight. He had simply left the aircraft in stable flight configuration and jumped fully expecting the B-17 to crash within minutes. The idea that his bomber had flown on for possibly an hour or more, navigated changing winds and air currents, descended from altitude, found a suitable landing field, and executed a perfect landing, all by itself, was beyond his comprehension. Military investigators attempted to reconstruct how this could have happened. The autopilot system on a 1944 B-7 was primitive by modern standards. It could help maintain heading and altitude in calm conditions, but it could not navigate, adjust for changing winds, descend safely, lower landing gear, or execute the complex series of actions required for landing. Yet somehow all of these things had occurred. The landing gear had extended. This required pulling a specific lever in the cockpit with considerable force. The aircraft had descended in a controlled manner, not the wild dive of a pilotless plane, and it had lined up with a field and touched down smoothly. Some investigators theorized that the trim tabs had been set perfectly purely by chance, allowing the aircraft to maintain stable flight longer than expected. They suggested that the slow fuel burn gradually lightened the aircraft, changing its center of gravity in a way that naturally caused it to descend. They proposed that perhaps the landing gear had been damaged earlier and simply fell into place due to gravity when the aircraft's attitude changed. But none of these theories fully explained what dozens of witnesses saw: a bomber circling a village, lining up with a field, and executing what appeared to be deliberate, controlled landing. Couldn't of the crew have remained aboard longer than the others, setting the aircraft on course before jumping? Investigators considered this possibility, but Lieutenant Cronin insisted he was the last man to leave, and he personally watched each crew member exit before him. Could someone have jumped from a different position than the bomb bay? Perhaps from the waist gun position and been killed in the fall without anyone knowing. Search parties scoured the area beneath the aircraft's presumed flight path, but found no body, no parachute, no evidence of another jumper. The Ghost Fortress was not the only self-flying bomber of other self-flying aircraft World War II, though it may be the most famous. In November 1944, another B-7 landed itself on a German airfield after its crew bailed out. German soldiers approaching the aircraft found it empty, engines running exactly like the Belgian incident. There's also the famous case of the Cornfield bomber, though that was a jet fighter in 1970, not a World War II bomber. The pilot ejected during a flat spin, and the aircraft somehow recovered and landed itself in a farmer's field. These cases suggest that under very specific, very rare circumstances, aircraft can indeed fly and even land themselves without human control. But what makes the Belgian Ghost Fortress so remarkable is the distance it flew and the precision of its landing. This wasn't a simple glide to Earth. This was sustained flight over enemy territory through changing wind conditions across dozens of miles, ending in a landing that professional pilots called perfect. Some aviation experts who have studied the case believe the aircraft must have been in an incredibly precise trim configuration when Cronin left the cockpit. Others think there may have been an unusual atmospheric condition that day. Perhaps a steady wind from directly behind that helped stabilize the bomber and pushed it westward. But nobody has ever provided a fully satisfactory explanation. The bomber itself was eventually recovered by Allied forces and examined by engineers. They found no unusual modifications, no secret autopilot system, no hidden technology that could explain its autonomous flight. It was a standard B-17G, exactly like hundreds of others flying combat missions over Europe. The aircraft was eventually repaired and put back into operation, though several pilots later admitted that flying it gave them an unsettling feeling. A few outright refused to take the controls of the so-called Ghost Fortress, uneasy about piloting a plane that had seemingly proven it didn't need humans at all. Lieutenant Cronin and his crew completed their tour of duty and returned to the United States after the war ended. Most of them rarely spoke about the Ghost Fortress incident, finding it almost impossible to describe to anyone who hadn't seen it themselves. How could they explain watching their bomber land perfectly on its own after they had bailed out? How could they reconcile their training and experience with something that simply shouldn't have been possible? Cronin himself gave very few interviews about that day. When asked for an explanation, he would only reply that he didn't have one. He had jumped expecting to see his aircraft crash, and somehow it didn't. That was all he knew. Some members of the crew developed quiet superstitions about the event. They believed their bomber had been blessed, or perhaps just impossibly lucky, and that this same luck had carried it home even after they were gone. Others took a more practical stance, insisting there had to be a mechanical explanation, even if no one had discovered it yet. But all of them agreed on one point. They had witnessed something extraordinary that September afternoon in 1944, something that defied all logic and would leave investigators puzzled for decades. The Belgian villagers who saw the landing never forgot the sight. For years afterward, the older residents of Kortenberg would retell the tale of the flying fortress that landed itself, describing how it circled their village as though searching for home. Some claimed they could see through the cockpit windows as it passed low overhead, and that nobody was inside. Others said the bomber appeared to be guided by an invisible hand. The barley field where it came down became a local landmark, and villagers would point out the spot where the American plane rested that autumn day. Modern aviation experts remain divided over what really happened. Some argue that the landing was merely a chain of remarkable coincidences, a perfect storm of favorable conditions that allowed the aircraft to remain stable and touch down safely by sheer chance. They remind skeptics that improbable is not the same as impossible. Others believe the official story leaves out key details, perhaps information lost in time or locked away in still classified files. They note that certain documents from the investigation are missing or remain sealed, suggesting there may be facts about the incident never made public. What makes the Ghost Fortress legend endure is how it fuses mystery, science, and human experience. There's the mechanical enigma of how it occurred, the puzzle that even seasoned aviators cannot fully solve. There's the human side, a crew forced to abandon their aircraft, watching their livelihoods and training defied in an instant. And there's that haunting image witnessed by the Belgian farmers. A massive bomber, empty and silent, gliding through the sky and landing itself as though guided by unseen hands. The event also raises profound questions about what was truly understood about flight dynamics in 1944 and even today. Modern airplanes can land automatically with computer assistance, but that technology didn't exist during World War II. Yet somehow, a bomber with crude 1940s instruments and a basic autopilot system managed to perform a complex series of actions that should have required human judgment. It suggests that, under rare conditions, an aircraft might achieve a form of autonomous stability that science still doesn't completely understand. World War II produced countless tales of survival, luck, and events that seem to defy reason. But the Ghost Fortress stands apart because it was witnessed by dozens of people, examined by military investigators, and supported by physical evidence that could not be ignored. The plane really did land on its own. That's not rumor or myth. It's recorded fact, verified by multiple witnesses and official documentation. What remains unsolved is how and why it happened. Today, the story of the Ghost Fortress is sometimes taught in aviation programs as a case study in unusual aircraft behavior, though it's always presented without a definitive conclusion. It continues to be cited in discussions about autopilot systems, flight control, and the limits of human understanding.